The 75th anniversary of the NATO alliance is being celebrated in Washington, D.C. as we speak. It started this morning to great fanfare. Lots of folks from literally all over the Western world have gathered in Washington. I'm sure there's going to be no shortage of celebrations and speeches coming out and declarations of how amazing all the things that we've done are, and how we're a bulwark for defense going forward. But folks, there are some real problems involved with what's going on here. Let's don't get so caught up that we look back at what happened, over the past 75 years, that we lose sight of where these leaders are wanting to take this alliance, and therefore, by extension, your security in the Western world. And folks, it's a lot more serious than what you may think. And I'm not one bent to that much hyperbole, and I generally keep things on kind of an even keel. But when something as egregious as what's happening right now under our eyes, under the guise of a celebration, I think you need to know about it. Now, I'm going to explain a little bit about the past of the 75 years, because this is not just a diss on NATO and, it's ridiculous or whatever. There has been some times in its past where it has been extremely valuable and necessary and useful for the holding of peace. But some things have been changing, and they are now at risk of coming off the rails. And stick with me, because toward the end of this, I'm going to give you some of the current things. And there's a piece in the Washington Post today that's especially egregious, and something I'm going to spend some time on, from former Speaker of the House and current member of Congress, Nancy Pelosi. NATO is a bulwark against tyranny. Now, that briefs well to a lot of people who, I guess, are supportive of the Democratic Party and even of NATO itself. It sounds really good, but I'm going to show you why that is much, much more dangerous than appears on the surface. But first of all, let's get a running start into this, because NATO while it's got some problems right now, there has been a time when it was profoundly useful to security for the Western world and the preservation of peace on the globe. It's played a vital role in that. And in fact, this is the 75th anniversary in Washington, because the first one in 1949 was also in Washington, and that's a picture there of the original signing ceremony in Washington. It is at the time in 1949 that when this was done, this was, literally some of the embers of World War II were still burning in some parts of Europe. You had the Soviet Union, who had turned from an ally of the United States and the Western folks against the Nazis, had turned into a very significant adversary. And, they continued to grow their army. They continued to grow their tanks, their other armored vehicles, and were posing a significant conventional threat to virtually all of Western Europe. And by extension, American vital national interests could also be at risk. And then, of course, as it escalated into a nuclear confrontation of the two sides with their growing nuclear arsenals, things took on an even more dramatic flavor. So when the Soviet Union first started threatening the West, it was necessary to have an alliance, because you had virtually, even though they were on the winning side, all the European powers had suffered egregiously during the war and lost millions of men, and their country had been decimated, and their industrial capacities were very weak, and they were very, very vulnerable. And so it was necessary to have the strength of the United States, both politically and diplomatically, as well as industrially, with our arsenal of democracy, as it was called. All those things were necessary and were useful. And of course, we had the infamous 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, where the world was literally on the brink of nuclear disaster. But other than that, and actually even partially because of the balance of power that existed there was no war. And there was the Cold War, but because there was basic equilibrium between the East and the West along that demarcation line in Europe, things were relatively stable. I actually served in Europe when my first, as a private in 1985. My first tour of duty was in Europe, and I was part of an MLRS, multiple launch rocket system crewman. And we helped to go all kinds of exercises that were aimed at, preserving the peace or getting ready should the Soviets ever come across the famous Fulda Gap you may have heard about. When I became an officer and I guess the late 1980s, I also went back to Europe with the 2nd U.S. Cavalry, which had an active patrol mission on the border between the East and West, and we were always on guard against any possible incursions, et cetera, what could happen there, as the Soviets did on the other side. Things were in balance. All that was going good, really, until 1991 came. The U.S. fought its war in Desert Storm, which I also participated in with the 2nd U.S. Cavalry. That same unit, we actually fought a large tank battle, the Battle of 7-3 Easting. But then months later, the Soviet Union finally collapses. And of course, it just completely disillusioned. And then all these countries go independent, and the Warsaw Pact ceases to exist. And in that moment, this is where there was a golden opportunity. So in 1991, basically 1992, early 1992, the whole reason for the NATO alliance existing changed. Now then, all of a sudden, it's not just about a balance of power to preserve the peace. Now then, one side totally collapsed its military power. It would have been a great opportunity at that point to reach out to the Russian side and say, hey, let's help you guys become a member of the European security, and let's actually work together. But instead, in the mid 1990s, just a few years later, we started talking about expanding NATO. Now, listen, I'm not going to go into a lot of depth here. I know there's lots of different views on it, but this, in my view, was where we started going wrong. Just imagine you had the NATO as it was with its original 12 members, later to add Turkey and Greece and several others. But as the NATO that existed in 1991, that was sufficient to balance of power the entire Warsaw Pact and the entire Soviet Union military power. What rationale would you have exerted to say we need to expand NATO? It needs to get bigger, because the whole purpose was balance of power. This is very important to understand. The whole utility of NATO was a balance of power, so neither side, conventionally or nuclear, could attack the other, and there was no war. But now then, the balance is dramatically shifted in the NATO favor, in the Western favor. So there's no need to expand militarily, because you already had something to prevent war. Now then, you're overwhelmingly superior, so you don't need to expand it, but we chose to. And that's exactly what happened. And I actually I had a bit of an odd military career. I got out of active duty in 1994, and in 1997 went to work for U.S. Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison here in Washington, D.C., and was on staff and actually helped, was part of the debate. And the reason I went to work for her in large part was because she was against NATO expansion, and I thought it was a terrible idea even back then. And so I actually got to help her. I drafted a few of her op-eds on the subject, and in one famous time, actually the only time, because I was not a relative, I was a low-ranking member of the Senate staff there, but I did get to go with her on the House Senate floor, rather, when she was debating on the expansion issue with then Senator Joe Biden. So that was an interesting engagement I had, because he was very much the leading advocate for expansion of NATO. That's going to come back to play here in a minute. But as we continue to go forward, now then we went from being a balancing power to moving further and further to the east against a weakened, dramatically weakened Russia compared to the USSR. And of course, what's that going to do to Russia? Now, just imagine if the roles were reversed. Seriously, just think about this for a minute. If the United States suddenly stopped being a part of NATO, or let's say that NATO was disbanded after 1991, because we just said we don't need a military alliance anymore. And then all of a sudden China or even Russia starts talking about having a military alliance with Mexico, or any of the Latin American states, for example, started moving closer to our border. We would say, hey, what's this all about? We don't pose any threat to anyone. Why would you want to expand a military alliance here? I mean, obviously, we would have taken dramatic action. You can see where this is going. Logic and ration, just human responses the way they are. Strip off the national names. People are people. And if you start expanding a military alliance towards you, you're going to start taking a more defensive posture. You're going to start taking more action to defend your interest. We would do it. The Russians did do it. So now then we have things continuing on to escalate. Obviously, the Senator Hutchison and any of our efforts were not successful. NATO was expanded in 1997, continued on with multiple tranches after that. And then came 2008, which is where the seeds of the Russia-Ukraine war in 2022 first were planted. And that is when NATO, for the first time, expressly said, we will invite NATO into Ukraine and into Georgia, which were directly on Russia's border on the plane. And this is important to understand, too. The difference between Ukraine as opposed to the Baltic states, it has a lot to do with history and geography, because that is the path through the Ukraine plains that Napoleon used to invade Russia, that Hitler used to invade Russia, and because it's wide open territory and it's very, very difficult to defend, as opposed to up in the north where the Baltics are. There's a lot of canneling terrain, and it's not conducive to large-scale military movement on the ground, so it's a lot easier to defend. So they didn't like it, but they could handle that because it's a narrow band here. But then the Ukraine border is certainly wide open. So that was why it was a big, big difference, and it wasn't very far from Moscow, where it isn't, rather, that border. So when we declared we were going to let them in, that really started a clock ticking. It took 15 years for it to finally go off, but that's what spawned the Russia-Ukraine war. Don't care if anybody agrees with that. Don't care if you don't like it. That's just self-evidently true. It's cited by the Russian side. There was no other rational reason why they would want to go to war with Ukraine, because otherwise it would be nothing but a lose. There's nothing to gain by trying to seize some of this eastern territory in Ukraine. It is absolutely about the security of it. Again, you don't have to agree with it, but that is the stated desire or outcome of Russia. It was entirely predictable. So if NATO is supposed to exist to keep the peace, then why were we doing things to expand it that put peace progressively in the rearview mirror? Now, that actually gets to something here, what I call the original sin. So in that same 1997 period I mentioned a second ago, when the debate was going on, that's when we had the first female Secretary of State we ever had in Madeleine Albright, and to great fanfare, President Clinton inaugurated her, or rather oversaw the process of having her sworn in as the new Secretary of State. Note what he says here, because this is going to come back to haunt us.
I thank the Senate for its swift and unanimous approval of her nomination. That reflects the confidence that all of us have in this remarkable American. It also sends a strong signal of the Senate's willingness to work with us to fashion a constructive and bipartisan foreign policy to advance the national interest of America. This is a time of great hope and opportunity. If we are going to realize its promise, we must recognize that our global leadership is essential. In the next century, no less than this one, America must continue to be the world's greatest force for peace and freedom and prosperity. Madeleine Albright has the strength and wisdom to help ensure that America remains the indispensable nation.
The indispensable nation. As far as I know, that's one of the first times it was ever uttered specifically like that. Of course, Madeleine Albright will then go on to say it throughout her term and tenure as the Secretary of State. But this is the original sin, because this is saying that we want peace and stability, but only on our definition. We don't care about what anybody else thinks. We don't care about what our adversaries think. We only care about what we want. And because we have self-designated ourselves as the indispensable nation, mentally now we are coming to believe that. Now, that was highlighted even more in 2023, a year after the Ukraine-Russia war started. And you can see how it went from that statement there to kind of quasi, well, it's plausible it could be for something good. He did say peace and stability and all that. But now then, let's see how it's metastasized. And here on 60 Minutes, President Biden was asked, could the context, by the way, for this is, could the United States support both Ukraine and Israel? This is shortly after the Israeli country was attacked by the terrorist strike on October 7th. He was asked, can we do both? Now, his answer is going to specifically get to that point, but watch the mentality underneath it.
We're the United States of America, for God's sake. The most powerful nation in the history, not in the world, in the history of the world. The history of the world.
Now, you're going to see it didn't stop there even because in 2024, this is actually just very recently, President Biden went a little bit further, and he here again harkens back to what happened in 1997 about the indispensable nation. Check this out.
We don't walk away from our allies. We stand with them. We don't let tyrants win. We oppose them. We don't merely watch global events unfold. We shape them. That's what it means to be the indispensable nation. That's what it means to be the world's superpower and the world's leading democracy.
Okay, Gary, can I ask you if you can replay the one from Clinton again? I want to make a sharp distinction here between what Biden just said and what Clinton originally said. Watch this, Gary, if you can.
I thank the Senate for its swift and unanimous approval of her nomination. That reflects the confidence that all of us have in this remarkable American. It also sends a strong signal of the Senate's willingness to work with us to fashion a constructive and bipartisan foreign policy to advance the national interest of America. This is a time of great hope and opportunity. If we are going to realize its promise, we must recognize that our global leadership is essential. In the next century, no less than this one, America must continue to be the world's greatest force for peace and freedom and prosperity.
Okay, that's good, Gary, right there. For freedom, peace, and prosperity. Now then you juxtapose that with what Biden just said here, that now then we shape events. That's what it means to be the indispensable nation. We are going to tell people what's going on, what they're going to do. We don't sit around and watch things happen. You see, it went from peace and stability to now this aggressive kind of in your face, we're going to do what we want to do. And now then you saw just a week ago where President Biden actually went a step further when he didn't say that now that we're just shaping events. Now that he's saying we're outright running the show.
You know, not only am I campaigning, but I'm running the world. And that's not how it sounds like hyperbole. But we are the essential nation in the world. Madeleine Albright was right.
You see the progression there from our leadership is necessary for stability to now then I'm running the world. And he believes that. And look, it's not just him. He's just the latest. But this has been a progression going on where American presidents, and you can go back to Obama, you can go to certainly to George Bush, even before that, and to Trump, and to a large regard, people keep thinking, these presidents keep thinking that we're running the show here. And it never has been as strong as what it was just articulated with Biden there. But that's where we're going here. And now then I'm going to show you why this is getting more dangerous. If it's just rhetoric, that's one thing. Maybe you just roll your eyes. But folks, this is a lot more than that. So here again, I want to show you is the Washington Post piece from this morning on the eve of, not at the beginning of this nation celebration for the NATO enlargement, where we want to go in the future. These are some of the things that Pelosi is saying. The first part here is that she says what she thinks is the reason for NATO now. Upon signing the North Atlantic Treaty, U.S. President Harry Truman declared, "We believe that it is possible for nations to achieve unity on the great principles of human freedom and justice." 75 years later, as the NATO summit convenes in D.C., the NATO alliance continues to, quote, stand as a bulwark against tyranny. Unfortunately, she continues to write, tyranny is on the march in Eastern Europe. Russian President Vladimir Putin's war of conquest in democratic Ukraine is emblematic of this sad trend. Let me explain to you why that's an issue. The bulwark against tyranny. No, that is not what NATO was formed against. NATO was formed as a very practical, specific, on the ground military deterrent against another very specific military power in the Soviet Union. It wasn't against some theoretical thing of bulwark against tyranny, because who can even define what tyranny means? Tyranny to one person is a defender of freedom on another side. It depends on which side of the line you're on. So everybody has a different interpretation of what that even means. But you have changed it from the Western military alliance was against the Soviet military alliance with the Warsaw Pact, tank versus tank, aircraft versus aircraft, missiles, and all that kind of stuff, nuclear weapons. That's what it was for, a physical defense. She is changing that now to a mental construct that looks for dragons to slay. Because, folks, there's not a balance of power right now. The West remains overwhelmingly in total military capacity, far, far greater than what Russia has today. Now, that could change in the future, but it isn't the truth right now, and it won't be for the distant future. Even if Russia went on a massive buildup, it would take years to undo this. And there's no reason to think that they would unless they're compelled to do so. Ergo, if this mentality continues to be progressed and actions keep going on to it. Now, let me show you what the next thing is. Speaking of the actions, what she is saying is that, quote, as the NATO summit begins, our allies and partners should take steps to support the pro-democracy movement on the ground in Belarus. That's not a misprint. It's not supposed to be Ukraine. She means Belarus, while increasing pressure on Putin's crony Lukashenko and, by extension, Putin himself. Now, this whole article goes on a long, long tirade about Belarus. So she is changing the focus of being on Russia and putting a crosshairs on Belarus. Now, what do you think there's a response is that going to get? Because now she's saying that NATO should no longer be about defense. It should no longer be about arming Ukraine. It should no longer be about weakening just Russia. Now she wants to expand the target list into Belarus. So Russia's main military ally in there. So you can see now that from the other side of this, they're going, hang on, NATO is not a neutral situation. NATO is now on the march, as she said. NATO is going forward. And as Biden himself said, the president of the United States, the leader of NATO, is that we are running the world. Now, what human being on the planet is going to be passive in the face of that, especially when they have the largest nuclear arsenal on the planet? Are they going to be passive about this? Are they going to say, all right, well, I mean, yeah, it's about democracy, and that's what the world is about, so I guess we're in the wrong. Okay, do whatever you want. I mean, it's absurd to even say that out loud. Now, there's been a lot of talk lately about, some of the NATO unity is not as strong as it may have appeared, and certainly less than it was in the past. But Viktor Orban is leading a big movement among many NATO, at least 4 different NATO nations, towards looking for peace to end this. And he wrote a piece a week ago in Newsweek, which unfortunately didn't get a lot of notoriety. It should, and I'm going to highlight it again here. He wrote, "The point of NATO is peace, not endless war," or at least that's what it ought to. One of the key things he wrote in there was, quote, "It is worth remembering that the most successful military alliance in the history started as a peace project, and its future success depends on its ability to maintain peace. But today, instead of peace, the agenda is the pursuit of war. Instead of defense, it is offense. All of this runs counter to NATO's founding values." And you can just see it on the ground. It's self-evidently true, because that's exactly what's going on. You saw it right there with your own eyes from the President of the United States, from a very influential U.S. member of the House of Representatives, former Speaker of the House, the Washington Post. Folks, all of those messages are received loud and clear on the Russian side. And in fact, on sides all over the world. China, guarantee, is paying attention to this. There's a big meeting coming up of the BRICS nations in October of this year. Now, what do you think that those nations are going to do when they see what the military alliance of NATO is now threatening to become? Because how do they know that next year they won't be in the crosshairs? Right now, we just added Belarus. But what other countries are going to be added next time if they run afoul of what the West wants, of what someone in Washington who claims he's, quote, running the world is going to think? They're going to continue to move in directions that are antithetical to our interest, not just militarily, but economically. Those kinds of things are entirely preventable, but they're also entirely predictable. Just the human nature. Forget about what country you're from. Any country, and certainly ours has been that way in the past in different regards. There's always the Revolutionary War in the 1770s, 1780s. We remember that pretty well, most of us. And a lot of that was because we were being imposed upon. And we rejected, we rebelled. And that same thing is happening here. Why would we think that human nature is going to suddenly be different for vast tracts of the world than it was for us? This is self-defeating, what we're doing here. We are putting our nation at increasing and unnecessary risk. If we had just frozen NATO where it was and not even added to it, but just kept it where it was, if we didn't add any nations, so we didn't give anyone any reason to rearm, any reason to get stronger, any reason to attack their neighbors, then the most likely outcome, you can never predict. Things could have turned in a different way. So I can't predict anything, but the most likely rational aspect or assessment is that Russia would have done its best, because as it was trying to integrate more with Western Europe, to become more part of the European security architecture, which is what it wanted to do. And there was every reason to think that trend would have continued had it not been for NATO expansion. And so now then, in this summit here, we're going to again be talking about building a bridge to the future for NATO enlargement into Ukraine. Despite everything that's happened, despite the war that's been going on, despite the stated position of the Russian side that is an existential threat to them for which they will continue to fight. And if worse comes to worse, they will use nuclear weapons. They've been unambiguous about that. And it is foolish to the highest degree to believe that's not going to happen and to keep pushing. And yet, you see with your own eyes, that's exactly what we're doing. We're continuing to push and expand the mentality of NATO, not just the target set, into another country here. It should be so clear and crystal clear, even if you love NATO, if you love national security, if you love a peaceful world, you should be able to see the logic that the path we're going down is unsustainable. It will not produce peace. Viktor Orban is right. If you change NATO back to something where it's actually a defensive organization again, and where it's actually seeking peace, then you have a real shot, even as late as this, to actually see that come about. It still isn't too late. There are still some things we can do. The first thing we should do is recognize ground truth reality that the war in Ukraine will never be won against Russia. Russia will never be defeated. They will never be forced out of their territory. There is no rational, logical path to having that happen on the ground. I could go into many reasons why. There's a bunch of videos we have in our archives there. Please go and look at any number of them. We can lay it out in detail. But there is no path, and it's clear and unambiguous. So what we should do is recognize that and say, let's seek for a negotiated settlement. The best deal we can get for Ukraine, the best one that's possible for it. Then you can build up defenses after that. You can keep building the eastern flank of NATO if that's what you want to do, if that's what the countries there want to do. And I wouldn't speak for any of them. If I was on the eastern flank of NATO and right near Russia, I may have a different view entirely. Fair enough. You guys do what your national interests require. No one would want to stop that in defense. So that's something that can be done here. Then you've taken away some of the fears that the Russian side has and some of the things that they show their population that, the West is out to get us. The West wants to destroy us. All of a sudden you undercut those risks and the statements because you're not doing it anymore. Now we have a chance to not have any more war, and we can get this war off the table, and we can get back to the very long process it's going to take already to heal and to move back into a position where we can again have the possibility for an integrated security architecture within all of Europe so that everyone benefits from it. And as I close here, I want to leave you with one other specific thing, because there's a great piece published by Defense Priorities by my organization that I work for, by Benjamin Friedman. It is called A New NATO Agenda, Less U.S., Less Dependency, and by extension, more security. Some of the key points in there, and by the way, we have the link to this in the description here if you want to go and read the whole thing. I highly recommend it. But three things I want to point out here is, number one, the United States should aggressively reduce its force presence in Europe. Now, that may seem counterintuitive because we have surged lots of forces in there, especially since 2022. But folks, that doesn't do anything to keep us safe. All it does is continue to reinforce on the Russian side that they have reason to keep moving their forces to the West and to keep trying to fight to gain more territory so that they can defeat Ukraine. And of course, their desire is to have a rump Ukraine in between NATO and Russia. They don't, despite what people ridiculously claim that Russia wants to go and invade NATO, they have no interest in doing that. They want the opposite. They want space between them and NATO. So they actually probably would never go beyond the Dnieper River, even if they go all the way up to that point, because then it undercuts their own security. And they're not being foolish with what they're doing. They actually have a rational plan. Even if you don't like, even if you hate Russia, it's still a rational plan to provide security for them. So if by withdrawing our forces and moving them back to the United States, or at least moving them in a less, what's the word I'm looking for, provocative posture, then we again reduce the reason why Russia would want to continue moving to the West. And listen, let me be clear on this. The United States does, in fact, have the most powerful military on the planet, especially in terms of force projection and the ability to project force around the world. We have incredible airlift, sea lift. We can move forces anywhere we need to. So by withdrawing them from the eastern part of Europe does not put us in any additional risk. We can always move anybody back if there's a need to it. That's why we're a superpower right now. But we should not exploit that and think that we are unlimited in power. And that's one of the great failures of the Western world. Instead of recognizing we do have power and we should use it judiciously and wisely, we think it's unlimited power and that nobody can do anything against us, which is absurd and patently untrue. So that's one of the first things that we should do. That lessens tensions, and it does not put us at any additional risk, and it does save some money. Number two, Gary, if you could bring that back up. The next thing I wanted to talk about was he said, Ben wrote, this would be consistent with NATO's original balancing purpose and the U.S. expectations then that garrisoning Europe was a temporary expedience, not a permanent tool of U.S. dominance. See, NATO was never supposed to be a permanent thing. Many of you may be aware of George Washington and his famous final speech as President of the United States, his farewell address, in which he expressly warned against don't have permanent enemies, don't have permanent alliances. Let the conditions that exist foster that, because if you have permanent alliances, then you permanently attach yourself to the needs of others, which shift over time. And maybe it's not to your advantage in the future. That's exactly what it was with NATO. When we started, there was a good reason for it. Conditions have dramatically changed right now. And yeah, you see Gary put that up there on the screen. George wrote, why by interweaving our destiny with that of any other part of Europe, entangling our peace and prosperity in the toils of European ambition, rivalryship, interest, humor, or caprice. It is true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. That was great advice when he wrote it. I think that was 1798, and great advice today. And we're seeing the reasons why very graphically played out right now. Gary, bring that back up again. There we go. The result of the Russians' invasion of Ukraine underlined this happy point. Russia has proven weaker than conventional wisdom held. Now, again, NATO was formed against the Soviet Union and its massive armada of like 50,000 tanks, millions of troops, thousands of combat aircraft, and of course, thousands of missiles. None of that exists. None of that exists. So we don't need this massive bulwark on the other side of it anymore. So we don't need to continue to have all of that force in there. We just need to have the ability to backstop it. The defensive alliance, even if you want to continue it for some amount of period in the future, it needs to be commensurate with the risk. Not some ethereal thing like bulwark against tyranny, which it can mean whatever anybody wants it to mean. It has to mean something tangible and specific like the balance of power. When you look at the balance of power that exists today, it is overwhelmingly on the Western side. So Russia has been unambiguous, and Putin himself has expressly admitted this. He is aware that his side is much weaker conventionally than the NATO/Western side. So he would never take the opportunity to attack into something where he would be certain to either lose or to have to result to nuclear weapons. That would be suicidal. And you can say whatever you want about Putin. He is definitely not suicidal. And in fact, everything shows he wants to have the security of his country and on his borders secure. Let's take advantage of that. Let's exploit his desire to do that so that we don't push him unnecessarily to do something that is not in our favor and that is not to our benefit. That is the whole point here. That's what NATO should be doing right now. We should be a sober, cold-hearted look at what can we do to make sure our nations are safe and secure and that we don't get into any wars and that we actually seek peace. We actually prioritize diplomacy. We don't seek to push somebody else. We don't seek additional enemies to slay. No dragons to slay. We don't want to do anything that's going to cause us to have to use our military, much less spawn an attack by a fearful nation and in a fearful alliance, perhaps, if it goes into that direction. We've already seen, let's be honest with this, and I want to leave you with this as we close. How have we done since 2022? How have we done since 1997? How have we done since the end of the Cold War up to this point? Is our nation safer because of our actions? Is the Western Alliance stronger today because of the things that we've done so far? Russia and China are now something close to a quasi-alliance, certainly diplomatically, and increasingly in trade and other areas, which renders a lot of our sanctions against them pointless because now Russia has additional paths where they don't have to have Western help. And so these sanctions fall on deaf ears in many cases. Russia and North Korea. Now then, Russia's given North Korea probably help with their Space Force and their rocket force. And in response, they get lots of rockets themselves, artillery shells, other kinds of support, now possibly even troop support in the form of a limited number of North Korean soldiers and engineering units. North Korea, as well as, Iran is also, there's a famous or a big picture right now of Modi, who is visiting Russia, and they're in this big bear hug because they're getting closer and closer together. Like I said a minute ago, this BRICS is getting larger and larger against Western allies and against Western economic interests. All of these things are against us. All of these things are predictable responses to trying to run the world, to trying to tell everybody else what to do. Is that better for us? The answer is unequivocally no. I don't care. I can't say this more strongly. I don't care if people don't like to hear it, especially when we're trying to celebrate NATO. But this is maybe our last opportunity to do something that makes sense. Because if we solidify these mentalities that I've talked to you in this episode, we could find ourselves in a war we can't win. And even if we did, the cost would be astronomically high and would leave us weakened in ways that we can't even imagine today. Wars that we should never fight. We have no business fighting. We cannot benefit from. We benefit from peace, not fighting a war, winning or losing. We should avoid that at all costs. It is time to change mentality while we still can and before it's too late. Thank you very much for that, for showing, coming on today or to following us today. We really appreciate it. This is not a popular topic for a lot of people, but you need to hear it because it's the truth. We got another show coming up today, actually. Larry Johnson there, he's going to be on at 2:00. You may have heard a lot of the news that it's being reported that a Russian missile hit a children's hospital and killed a lot of people. Larry Johnson's going to show us in very practical, graphic ways that by the most likely case is that's not what happened. And he'll tune in at 2:00 to find out what it is with that, what he actually showed. And one other thing I want to tell you about today is our membership that we keep talking about. I know a number of you, I think we're up over 50 now. A lot of people have joined, and we have a really good time with that. And I just want to remind you to like and subscribe. We always love it when you do that, but also join with Deep Dive. And this Friday, we're going to have our live Deep Dive huddle for a Deep Dive Army members. You can ask me anything. We kick around ideas and all kinds of thoughts and things about politics. We chat each other up, get to know each other better. And if you join and become a member of the Daniel Davis Deep Dive Army, you too can be a part of this huddle. We look forward to seeing you on Friday. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you at 2:00 this afternoon on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.